Okay, take two. So, fruits of the path. Something that has been a positive movement for me, positive development. I, I am finding forgiveness. Maybe that's one word for it. Or I don't know how this kind of perfectionistic thing started. I think it starts maybe fairly innocently. Who knows? Trauma, or maybe it's more innocent than that. But it's funny the different kind of inner orientations we toggle through. And it's one of the important things I could say on the path is to develop a levity, a lightheartedness, and a cosmic forgiveness is one way I'm thinking to express it right now. And where did I get that term from? I think from Richard Rohr. Not that I totally agree with everything Richard Rohr says. In fact, I don't feel as much resonance as I once did, but you pick up useful, and I guess this goes to the point I'm trying to make is like, is that you pick up useful things from different sources. Let me just try to lay out the point here. I think there's a broader sense in which what I'm about to say applies in our relational world, relationships with things and with people. But I'll use a specific context that this has been coming up for me, and it's around spiritual teachers. Although saying that, I'm already seeing ways that it's bigger than that. But let's just use that as an example, as a through line, if I'm using that right. I guess a simple way to say it is there's no perfect teacher. There's just not. You, at certain stages, and maybe all along the path in a certain way, wish there was a perfect teacher. Now, Jesus is that. Let me fundamentally undermine myself here. Jesus is that for me. But let's leave that aside just for a second. Not completely or totally or categorically or anything, but let's just leave that aside for a second. There's no perfect teacher. I found this gentleman. I'm not sure if I should say the name or not, but this teacher who I have been with in varying degrees of what word would I use here? Participation or contact participation, maybe, for many years. Somebody who I could say was there for me in a very difficult time. And helped me greatly. Showed great generosity, great support. And this is a person who Um, well, I'll just say his name, Craig Holiday. I don't know why I'm hesitating so much. So I think mostly what I'm going to say here is not like mean spirited or anything like that. It's certainly not the intention here. But Craig is a very remarkable person. He's a spiritual teacher and therapist. I guess he has a master's in counseling. Yeah, I have some questions around that appellation, that title. Is appellation the right word? That title. Um, but he's talented in what he does. He's gifted, and mostly, if I could kind of boil it all down to something simple, is he's got a big heart. You know, he really cares. He's got a big heart. Let's say it that way. I almost hesitate to ascribe caring to any person. I don't know if that's my own stuff, psychology there. I guess it's just hard to, you can't really say what's going on inside of anybody else. And to what extent are we genuinely altruistic, and to what extent is this genuinely, or is it always, is care always self-referential back to the individual? I know that sounds really cynical, but let me not go down that conversation path. He's a big-hearted person and has a lot of experiential knowledge and has had big awakenings, has done a lot of healing work himself. One gets the sense that they're in the presence of somebody who has some substance. I don't know what word I'm trying to use here. Maybe experiential knowledge is really the important piece here. That it's not a theoretical thing for him. He's kind of well known, I guess at this point, it'd be safe to say, worldwide. Now again, this is, the actual percentages of people who care about these kinds of topics, awakening, deep healing, it's a minority of people. So worldwide is, in a way, not quite the right word, but amongst people who are actively teaching and talking about Kundalini in a helpful, grounded way, and spiritual awakening and things like that. He's got people he's interacted with and helped, and I don't know if students would be the right word, but from across the planet, just because he's got something to say on the topic. And I went through something. I've chosen really not to frame it this way because something about it just doesn't really accord with my soul. But in a sense, you could say it went through I guess what's true says I went through a major crisis. And there was a big energetic component to that. Still is, but especially early on. I was just very destabilized, it was tough. It was a hard time, and I don't want to past tense it too much because I'm still in the thick of a lot of this stuff, but I'll just say it, that I went through a Kundalini activation or awakening, or following a very traumatic experience. And once that energy came online, it was like a raging stampede of horses or something, and my nervous system was just exploding through me. Like a dam had broken, and just tidal forces of energy were moving, and all kinds of crazy, crazy, crazy stuff that I don't really want to talk about. I don't really want to get into. And in a sense, I hesitate to even call it Kundalini because just because I just don't like thinking of it that way. I mean, there are other ways of thinking about it. You can just think of it as energy. It's like all this energy that has been trapped or suppressed or blocked, or even here, I've got, even after all this time, I struggle with how exactly to speak about it. But one way of speaking about it is just trauma releasing, energy releasing from the body, all the different layers of the body and of the being. And who cares, how you label it, but that's my point here, I guess. Anyways, so he was useful for me in a lot of that, and sort of normalizing it in a sense, and sort of giving me a language, but also an understanding which helped me psychologically, a way that I could kind of not get too, because the experience itself was already so overwhelming, and the ways that it interfaces with your psychology, and leads you into really distorted ways of thinking, and brings to the surface all kinds of crazy stuff. And so it was one little piece that was helpful, is that he kind of normalized some of what I was going through, that here was somebody who wasn't pathologizing me really, but was just having an honest conversation about, yeah, this is pretty common. I mean, again, population level, if we're looking at it at that level, it's not super common, but within a certain subset, a certain group of people that have these experiences, these are what I was going through was recognizable to him, and that was really helpful. And besides that, he just has a kind way about him, and he was a helpful person, and he was accessible, and he had personal experience to draw on, but also he's helped a lot of people. So and I'm sort of just, it's not so much really about this individual. I mean, it is, but it's also, I'm just trying to make a broader point here, and I'm using my own experience to do that, and something specific to do that. So give me some grace here. But when you're desperate for help and you find help, you can really kind of latch on to that help. I guess that's codependence, can become codependent. I don't know if codependency takes two to tango, so maybe you just become dependent from your side. And Craig is relatively healthy enough that I don't think that was really much of an issue from his side. But and to be fair, at the point that I found him, the point I was struggling, I think I had already done enough inner work, and mostly I just been burned enough in my relationships that the kind of codependent streak within me, it's not that I had healed it or resolved it. I wouldn't want to say it quite that way, although probably some had happened. It's just I had been burned so bad in previous relationships that I knew not to touch the fire. I knew that that wasn't the right path, even if I hadn't fully, integrate or even close to integrated or found I knew not to go down that path. And so, in a sense, there was always some spaciousness here. It's almost like I can look back in successive significant relationships in my life. There's been a lessening of that pattern of enmeshment. So by the time I came across Craig, but it was less. But I was also in such a dire, dire straits, dire circumstance that there was some of that, and that's not. I don't want to say it's all unhealthy either, because it's okay to reach out and to need help, and it's just kind of human to form a connection with somebody that's helping you. But there's a pressure. I'm trying to just inwardly figure out, where does this come from? And this isn't going to exactly describe, but there's this idealization, pedestalization, or maybe idealization is the better word, that can happen with a teacher or with a significant other, or just, people in general. And when somebody is generally a healthy person and a helpful person and has skills and has talents and things like that, it makes the process happen. It's understandable that some idealization can happen there. But everyone is partial. In this relative realm, so to speak, to be a total container of truth, that's just not what is implicated by this realm. It's just not it's not really possible in that sense. You may be totally embodied and held in the truth. I think that's not unfair to say, but let me throw in a couple other teachers here just to kind of give a broader sense of what I'm trying to get at here. So somebody like an Eckhart Tolle or an Adyashanti. Part of what I really there's a impeccability there. Again, impeccability is kind of a superlative term or absolutistic term, and nobody is truly impeccable. Pecado. I don't know what the Latin word is for sin, but I'm sure it has the Spanish word pecado. In English we say pecadillo, pecadillo, una pecadillo. I don't know if I've ever heard anybody in Spanish actually say pecadillo, but so I don't know what the Latin root is, but I'm guessing it's PEC or something, meaning sin. So impeccable, without sin. But nobody is really that way. But it's like there's a gradient here, and there are people who are more, let's say, integrous, have more integrity, have done deeper work, and perhaps we can consider cross multiple lifetimes. I don't know how that works. It's a vast universe. There's mysteries here. I've seen some of them myself, but I don't claim to have like a working schema of all this, and I don't know how much I would want to invest in one anyways. But for some reason, there are certain people who have imperfect metaphor here, but let's say who have diminished their shadow or transmuted or integrated, wounded parts, shadow parts, confusion. That process happens in people to a greater and lesser degree, and their teachings and the kind of community that springs up around them, I see as sort of a reflection to some degree of that inner work that's been done. And so somebody like an Adyashanti, you never want to say he's impeccable or perfect, but there haven't been great corruption, great scandals that I know of. And I'm definitely, that's part of why I'm making this video, is I'm open to there being that, we all have clay feet. I've heard things about Martin Luther King Jr. that make me, that complicate the picture for me, and that upset me, for to be totally honest. They don't destroy what I appreciate about him, but And now with Adyashanti, though, there is an asterisk. There's a little thing that kind of came up recently in the past couple of years about his having gone on anti-anxiety medications, and I don't know enough about it to really, but anyways, he's not a teacher I look at and think scandal, corruption, playing power games, abusing people. And again, maybe this stuff will surface, and even when stuff like this does surface, you have to do your due diligence and hold those things lightly, because you don't know the confusion in the person making the accusations. You weren't there, and it's kind of hard to disentangle some of this stuff. But in general, I think it'd be fair to say he's one of the, at that scale of teaching, having that many people participate in his teachings, and that there's a great deal of clarity there and a great deal of integrity there, and that he, there's something good and honest, not perfect, but you look at, I guess this is a Christian term, but the fruits of it, and you don't see a whole lot of scandal and corruption. It's usually power games, corruption usually fall into, extorting people or manipulating people for money, sexual exploitation, and just control over people, I guess, power, sex, money. Those are some of the main categories of abuse that you see come up, and I don't get that sense with Adyashanti. Eckhart Tolle, another person, again, not a perfect human being, but I don't get a real strong shadow of abuse coming from him. There's a levity there and a lightheartedness that I think it all lends itself to a sense of trustworthiness. And with Craig, I mostly, having interacted with him quite a bit, I feel pretty much the same about Craig. There's a goodness there, that there's an integrity there that I don't, maybe I could find some little things here. And there are teachers, obviously, for which what I'm saying is the exact opposite. So there's a spectrum is where I'm trying to demarcate from, let's just say, a Jonestown or something. I'm kind of mixing categories here, but, a spiritual leader who's just so off the deep end and unhealthy and toxic, etc. Unhealed, major shadows. And you see how that gets amplified and reflected in a community, I guess is part of the point I'm trying to make. Or an Andrew Cohen, or, forgive me for being specific with names. I'm not trying to throw anybody under the bus here. But, there's many examples out there. I'm sure you can fill in the blank of ways that, teachings and teachers and communities go off the rails. With Mooji, somebody I benefited a lot from and really like and appreciate in many ways. But, and again, I don't know what the truth of allegations are and things like that. So there's many more things I could say about all these topics, and maybe I should in other videos, but and so I found a teacher, and I felt pretty good about who he was, that there's a cleanliness. Is that a fair word? Teachings are coming through pretty cleanly. There's always going to be some human filter there, but more transparency there, and major generosity and all kinds of good virtues and stuff like that. But teachers are human. Teachers are flawed. And so you look for somebody with humility who's willing to be honest about their own flaws. And I like to think I have an intuitive sense of where there's manipulation and power games. Although even there, sometimes your own distortion can get in the way. Your own woundedness can get in the way of discernment. So that's sort of the ethical dimension. I'm not sure. I wasn't really intending to bring that in as strongly, but and I could say a lot more about that. But there's a wanting to have a teacher, one true teacher, and maybe that's just human psyche. Maybe I've just had that imprinted upon me from the people who I've looked up to spiritually along the path. One point, I was really into Ram Dass and just loved every podcast I could get a hold of, and just the transmission there. And maybe some of it comes from the relationship he has with Neem Karoli Baba, and that kind of traditional Indian mindset of you find the guru, you surrender to the guru. And it's like a devotional path, basically. And so maybe this is where some of this idealization comes from within me. And it's not bad that we have this inner homing device that recognizes shit from Shinola and that we're looking for the right teacher. That's not a bad thing. And I think there are teachers that are more appropriate for us and more appropriate for us at different times. In other words, a teacher could be right for you at a certain point, no longer makes sense, maybe comes online again later. It depends on where you're at on the path too, largely. But all these many caveats aside, it's like you want the one teacher and them to be the total fulfillment of the truth and the embodiment of, in other words, everything they say is a crystallization of divine essence, and it all perfectly aligns, and you just feel totally surrendered to it because there's a total truth there. And be very careful with that. Understand that that's an understandable desire. And again, there is something to the devotional path, and obviously to respecting a teacher and somebody who delivers and supports you. But the further you walk on the path, my contention is, and if I was a betting man, at least I could say it's been my experience, that you will become disillusioned. And that's going to be painful, irregardless, because you'll find out that the teacher is not everything you want them to be. And you need to have humility there too, to recognize sometimes they're not what you want to be because your desires are out of alignment and it's hitting on something inside of you. Sometimes it's just more innocent than that. They just have different perspectives on things, or different values around certain things politically, or even on a certain spiritual area, in certain spiritual areas or methods, teachings, understanding. It also may be that you're out of alignment with them because they are out of alignment. There's something unhealed in them, or there's some distortion they've fallen into. And I'm sure there's other reasons, but there will come a disillusionment, likely, and perhaps multiple. And I struggled with that, and I've kind of distanced myself, if we're talking in particular about this teacher, Craig, taking times away and kind of worked through some stuff. And I guess to be concrete, because there's things I can say within his teaching that just don't work for me, just don't make a lot of sense, just don't resonate for me. Many things in many ways where I find myself wishing, thinking, I wish you were more informed. That sounds really judgmental. Forgive me here if this is arrogance, but I don't even know if I want to get into specifics. That starts to sound pretty petty. But there's things that he teaches where I'm just like, nah, that doesn't make any sense to me, and I just don't see it that way. And certain aspects of his teaching where I'm just like, doesn't resonate, doesn't make a whole lot of sense for me. And if you're holding on to a really fixed identity, fixed concept of who the teacher is, and that there has to be this total alignment, and if there's any misalignment, then either they're totally to blame or you're totally to blame. Like, shit, well, he's the guru here, he's the master here, he's the authority, or whatever word. He's above me somehow, or however you're thinking of it, whatever the case is. So I must be out of alignment, must just be my lack of understanding. Sometimes maybe that's true, but that can be a really dangerous game too, and you don't have to gaslight yourself either. See, the whole point I'm trying to get at is I'm coming to a place which feels healthier of just not investing too much significance one way or the other in those misalignments and those things, allowing myself to really just disagree and be like, no, that doesn't make sense. It doesn't feel like the truth to me. It's not how I see it, you know. And being okay with that, you know. I don't, you know, allowing yourself to just have those things come up, to be your own person, to be different. There's a freedom there. There's a loneliness perhaps, or a fear there, or something. Where it's like you want to have total resonance and harmony and see things eye to eye. But maybe it's a fruit, is how I started this whole thing out. Maybe it's a fruit of just doing more and more work myself and realizing that the healing is not contingent upon Craig or fill in the blank, whoever that person is for you, whatever teacher. And there's more teachers for me besides just this one person. But, you know, my healing ultimately doesn't depend on total alignment with them or that person, really. It's like, give them that freedom too. It's like you give yourself that freedom from that. The more and more you find out, the more and more healing you do, the more and more commitment you have to your own healing process, less and less desperate you are for that alignment with somebody else. And it's a freedom for you primarily, but it's also freedom psychologically that you grant for them, even if you don't ever say it that way. And it humanizes them. It's like, I'm sure if you were to have talked to Kobe Bryant about his understanding of Michael Jordan, there'd be a similar, even if not identical, but there'd be some shared features about what I'm trying to express here. Where when he was really young, you know, Kobe in so many ways modeled his game and his approach to basketball after MJ. You could also say he just was a kindred spirit in some sense, that he had that kind of, you know, they call it the Mamba mentality, that killer instinct, or that just insane determination and drive and almost psychotic determination to succeed and to hone his craft and to outperform others and to compete. Can't think of exactly the right word here, in a similar way that Jordan had. But I think it'd be also true to say, and I've heard Kobe, I believe, say as much, and I don't think it's controversial or a secret, that he patterned his game off of MJ. But I bet if you were to have a conversation, RIP Kobe Bryant, with him, he would have told you that his image, his internal image, the esteem and the sort of image he had of Jordan evolved over time. That at one point he probably, I think, you know, I'm putting words in his mouth, but I don't think I think it'd be fair to say probably at one point he idolized him, right? I mean, we all do as kids with sports figures and other, you know, popular figures, and he idolized him and he looked up to him and he thought, man, this is the perfect player. You know, again, I don't know if Kobe would have expressed it this way. I'm just using it as an example that I don't think is too far-fetched. But then at some point, he started to get pretty good. He came into the league and he went from this kind of remote idol, icon, semi-god, say that, with a wink and a smile, some levity. I don't mean that too literally, but and at some point he met Michael Jordan, and so all of a sudden he's somebody he knows, still greatly esteemed, I'm sure at that point, however old he was, 18, 17, 18, 19. And then, he became in a sense, a colleague because they're in the same work environment. It's funny to think of sports that way, but they were colleagues. So that's a whole new dimension that comes in. Then he becomes a mentor where he's got this personal relationship with Jordan. And then at some point, Jordan's career, starts to sunset. Kobe's is on the ascendancy. And and they become, I don't know if this is how Kobe would express. I mean, Jordan is maybe not the best example because he truly is such a transcendent figure that evokes so much reverence as an athlete from other athletes and from other people who appreciate sports and basketball. But I'm sure there was an evolution there where it became more of a peer-to-peer type of a thing, more of a, even if level playing, yeah, maybe more of a level playing field. I don't know. Again, I don't know exactly how Kobe would have expressed it all, but I guess the basic idea is there would have been an evolution there in how you understand somebody the closer you get to them and as you evolve in your own path. And there's an individuation process, I guess. In some level, this is just kind of psychological development that happens. Psycho-spiritual development, I guess. I don't know. But I don't want to say that the student becomes the master or something like that. This is not in my case. I don't want to say that at all. I just notice that there's a lot of stuff that I just don't really agree with. And I keep, for a long time, and there's still parts of me that I don't agree with in terms of this specific teacher. And there's a part of me that thinks, man, maybe it's just because I'm missing the boat and I just need to do more work. But you could drive yourself crazy thinking that way, and you can gaslight yourself and try to fit yourself into a box that maybe just doesn't make sense for you. How could this teacher be so right, have such deep realization in some areas, and just some of the stuff they say just not really make any sense? I don't know. I don't have the answer to that. But I just notice I'm less and less worried about that. And that feels kind of nice. There's a freedom there, an independence there that allows you to be more at ease in a kind of almost paradoxical way with that teacher and with that teaching, where it's like, I still like this person. I still like him a lot. And in a way, I feel maybe there's a possibility that I'll like him more and more for the person that he is, because there's less projection there, there's less expectation there, there's less, you've kind of dealt with some of the disillusionment. There's a possibility there of more connection, where it's like you still resonate in the ways that you always resonated and find common ground, and that's still there. That doesn't have to change. But you just don't get too caught up in the stuff that doesn't work for you. And I could say that using that specific example, and it's not really, again, it's not about that. It's not about Craig, that teacher, or anything like that. And if anything, it's a testament to how much universality and commonality and goodness I have found in Craig, because there's 100 other teachers I could mention that I had, a little bit of a connection to, and just now I have zero interest in, or there's something, I hesitate in a sense to use the word friend, but it starts to have maybe a little bit more of a quality of that energy of a friend type relationship, or I don't know if it'll ever quite be that. But I started to say, I mean, I could say the similar things for somebody like an Adyashanti. Man, I consumed a lot of his teaching. There were long stretches for years where I was just everything I could listen to, and it did something inside of me. There was a great resonance there. But it's been years since I felt that resonance or gone back to really. It's almost like this is a Buddhist metaphor, the idea of the teaching or the teacher. I guess the teaching is the raft that gets you across the river. But once you're on the other side, you no longer need the raft. Not that I'm not. I mean, that kind of makes it sound a little bit. What's the word I'm looking for here? Like there's some ultimate endpoint. I don't know that that's really true. It's more like you get to the other side and now you no longer need the raft, but maybe now you need some hiking boots, right? So there's still the path goes on, but with Adyashanti, at some point I was just like, man, this guy just is I'm so snowed by his knowledge and his experience and his teaching. There's just so much to learn, so much to gain, so much to express or to engage with. But now I look at it and I still reverence it. I mean, geez, uh, he's offered so much in his teaching that I almost feel out of line saying something like this. So, but I don't mean anything bad by it. I think it's just me trying to be honest. But there's ways in which there's like a dryness sometimes with his teaching that doesn't. I mean, he comes out of, I guess, basically a Zen background, if I'm remembering correctly. Forget his teacher's name. I think she was just a Geordie. Shoot, I can't remember her name. But I think she was basically just a Zen teacher, I think, more explicitly. But there's parts of his teaching that just where I'm at now just don't really do much for me. There's that. And same with Eckhart. As amazing of a teacher as he is, as universal as his message is, it's like there's just certain things that my own path, certain nutrients that aren't provided in that teaching. Maybe that's one way to say it. Again, this is not coming. I'm trying to be humble in saying this, and it's like this is not coming from a place of like I am greater than these. No, not not even close. But that whole yeah, it's not like the student becomes the master and overtakes the teaching. It's not really like that, but it's like at a certain point you do kind of you've imbibed what you needed to from that teaching, I guess is one way to say it. I'm sorry, forgive me, not being super articulate here. But I think a good teacher also doesn't want to be idealized. So it's a freedom you grant them too by recognizing their humanity and deficiencies, if you want to say it that way. That's not totally the right way to say it, but relative to the nutrients you need, maybe there's a deficiency in that teaching. Not that the teaching's bad, not that the teaching's even deficient. It's not from that angle. So, um, but is there a lot that I still enjoy? And kind of the overriding thing here, especially when it comes to teachers, if I were to kind of lay down some criteria, and I'm totally not saying anything novel here, this is well trod territory, but just from my own experience, I think the important thing, it's almost like in psychology, is it Winnicott? I can't remember who has this. Certainly haven't read the primary sources, just, reading textbooks in some of my classes, that mention these theoreticians. But at some point I came across this term, the good enough parent. It's something like that. I don't want to use that parent metaphor too strongly because that can get kind of weird. The ways that you project parent image, I just don't even like that idea when it comes to teachers. But it's like a good enough. If I were to say it simply, it would be like a good enough teacher. And what's implied by that, when I unpackage that term, it's like that they are a good person, that there's some integrity there, that there's not like, at a minimum, basic obvious things, that they're not playing sexual abuse games, power games, money games. Be very careful of that kind of stuff. But do you sense a goodness there? Do you sense a generosity there? Is there a freedom to talk openly there? Is there I fought a lot with Craig over the years. Argued with, fought quite a bit. And found that there was an ability often to get to the other side. Sometimes, it became pretty bad at one point, some of the arguments. And partly just because I was going through so much crazy stuff, but even there, it's like if you've lived long enough and you've been around really unhealthy people, even when you get into an argument with somebody, that's not the criteria of whether or not somebody is a good teacher or a healthy person to be around. Because unfortunately, fighting seems to happen with most relationships, but there's degrees there too. And how are they in those moments when they're pissed off and you're pissed off and you're saying ugly things, or you're bringing something, or not even saying ugly things, but you're bringing something intense towards them? How are they reacting to that? What's, in those kind of more contentious moments, who are they in that moment? That's an interesting thing. And afterwards, are they really vindictive? Are they holding a grudge? I mean, there's just all these little subtle ways that you can kind of energetically discern and pick up on who somebody is. And so again, you're not looking for perfection, but is there a capacity there for having a tough discussion? Or the other thing, you, of course, fundamentally, I haven't really even breathed any oxygen into this dimension, because it kind of, I do in most videos, and to some extent, I hope it goes without saying, but I'll just be explicit. You are not perfect. This guy, I am not perfect. And so you got to factor that in. It's like a handicap or something. You got to factor that into the overall equation of when you're considering, when you're feeling disillusioned with a teacher. Again, many cautions there of not gaslighting yourself, not being overly harsh on yourself. Sometimes a teacher just is out of line. That's a possibility. Sometimes a teacher is abusive. Sometimes, it's just an honest difference of opinion and it's more innocent. But sometimes it's your own stuff. And so that's an important piece of all of this. It's funny because a lot of people kind of fall out with teachers, especially in the past, I don't know, maybe 10 years. I'm guessing this is, if there was some way to chart this data, I think it would probably have reached a peak, an apotheosis, a peak in the past 10 years. Apotheosis, is that the right word? Probably not. With all these sort of, and fueled in many ways by social media and the news landscape and all these other factors, but where the sort of political dimension of our being has become so hyper valenced. Is that the right way to say it? It's like the salience of our political identity, the relevance, the importance of it, the fixation of it, the obsession in some ways, culturally, especially in the U.S., but I think probably worldwide. There's ripples, probably especially in the U.S. and the Western world, but I'm sure there's ripples everywhere as the technology proliferates. But where we have sort of collectively lost our minds, and there's been this kind of hyper partisanship fueled by things like the algorithm and social media, and the ways that those amplify kind of inner processes that are part of the human psyche at this point in time. I don't know if I necessarily want to call them innate, but that's a deeper discussion where those dimensions in us come from. But that we could say that there's been this kind of hyper partisanship, hyper balkanization. Would that apply here? Tribalism in some sense. And I've seen some of this. I've intentionally not put too much effort or too much attention or energy into tuning into this, but where especially again, as I say, in the past decade plus or so, 10 to 20 years maybe, although really probably 10 to 15 years, where I think some of the divides in spiritual communities and fallouts with teachers and stuff, I think have come along the lines of political disagreements. And a part of it is leftist. I mean, both sides, even if we don't want to use that spectrum, every side here, but and I've done videos about this particular ideological fixation of leftism, that there's a kind of puritanical streak in it, kind of purity spiral that can happen, and there's a kind of pretension towards totalism, absolutism, religiosity, that the ideology, that really radical left identitarianism is one word for it, has a pretense towards, and maybe even not always explicitly so, sometimes explicitly so, but has a tendency towards a kind of pseudo spirituality. It becomes a kind of pseudo, it fills in that void for a lot of people. It becomes a very primary identity for people in a way that it is unhelpful, to say it mildly, unhealthy, distorted. It's like you're fixating at this lower plane. God is the foundation. God is ultimate reality. That's where your identity ultimately lies. If we're talking about the depths of who we are, children of God is one way of expressing it. But our identity, our root, our source is in God. And so it's not like politics is unimportant, but relatively speaking, it's a lower altitude. And if you shore up your identity there, you're cutting yourself off from the depths, and it's just things are bound to get, when you're not rooted, when you're rooted in something conceptually or ideologically, that's a shallow fix. You're in the shallow end of the pool. You're cut off from your own depths. So it's like you found a tide pool, somewhere along the, trying to think of what river I want to use here, the Columbia River, I don't know. And you've said this tide pool is the totality of this river. But eventually that becomes really stagnant, and you like shore up your identity there, you build walls around it, and you've lost that flow from God coming in, from truth. No, God is the source, the headwaters, and that's where everything is downstream from that. I can't think of the right metaphor. Forgive me. Maybe I've sketched it enough to kind of get the point across, but because so many people have become very identified with their political map, and because that's become so polarized, so has gotten to such, it's almost like this radicalization process. And it's not just leftist ideology, but that's been one of the, especially in the spiritual community, there's such a tendency in the direction of, because there are certain values, ultimately it's counterfeit, it's not the real McCoy, it's not the real deal in leftists, but there are certain values that resonate at a superficial level until you really start to see how the fruit of it, but that makes sense for spiritual people to align themselves with. Again, it's kind of that, in Christian terms, it's like the devil comes disguised as an angel of light. It's sort of like that. I think of leftism in some sense, because there's certain values that are certain words that they use that are corruptions of truth, corruptions of something that is true. Anyways, what was my point here? I guess it's that I think a lot of the fallout has happened in spiritual communities along political lines. And I felt some of that pull at times as well. Mostly for me, though, it's when I see and I felt this in Christianity, to be honest. I've done videos on this too, going to certain churches. It's when, for me, how it plays out is not really an ideological fixation where I then feel opposed to a teacher's ideological fixation. It's more like when I see how these ideologies have infiltrated the church, for example, in Christianity, or have infiltrated a specific teacher, such that you can tell that is really the more fundamental level of their identity. It's like that becomes their political commitments, everything else becomes deferential within their value system towards those political commitments. So if a spiritual teaching doesn't align with that, if the truth doesn't align with that, it doesn't matter. It's like within the church. Let me see if I can explain it this way. I've been to some very liberal churches, sort of on accident, at a certain point when I was going around trying out different things. Episcopalians was one of these churches. And because I had spent so much time in leftist ideology, activists, being around activists and things like that, not that I was ever fully in it, but it carries a certain energetic signature, is one way to say it. I mean, there's 1,000 specific ways I could break it down, but there's an overall energy there. And in these churches, this Episcopal one, I'm thinking is one example, it's like that had supplanted the truth. That had become the kind of this is a crude way to say it, and it's only because I can't think of something better, but it's almost like saying in those spaces, it was like I was basically just in an activist, a leftist ideological activist space that was wearing the garment of Jesus, that was wearing the garment of church. It was in a church, There were all the sort of superficial elements of a priest in religious garments and liturgical elements. There was Eucharist, there was Bible readings, but it was all you sensed in the background. It was all in reference to this social justice ideology. That was, is it the tail wagging the dog? I can't think of the right metaphor here. It's driving me insane. That was the more fundamental thing that was driving it, and that's just such a shame in those spaces, because it's like you're settling for the counterfeit, for this shoddy, shallow substitute, for this imposter, when you have the real deal in Jesus, in tradition, in God. It's something like that, and you sense that. This is what's been frustrating for me, is you sense that, how that ideology infiltrates and becomes the kind of puppet master, becomes the more fundamental value in these spiritual spaces, and you lose connection to the truth. It's like the truth is secondary to the ideology. It's something like that. And forgive me, I'll think of a better way someday to express it. As much as I've thought about this, I can never quite get my hands on it in a way that feels satisfying. But so that is something I've noticed, and that's where it's become an issue for me. But I think for a lot of people, it's just when a teacher expresses an opinion that is not ideologically aligned. Maybe that they say something positive about Donald Trump. As crazy as that sounds, all of a sudden that kind of implicit force that's really driving the show, but we can kind of, as long as we're all on the same political page, there's no friction there. It can stay implicit. But the moment there's like a political misalignment with a teacher, then you realize who your real master is. And it's that ideology that you've invested in. That's where you're really committed. Even if you're saying the spiritually wise things, and you're doing it in the context typically of an echo chamber, and so you don't recognize that you're in that echo chamber. It's implicit rather than explicit. But the moment a teacher says something that's politically out of alignment, politically heterodox, it breaks with your orthodoxy. Maybe that's one way of saying it. It's like, is your orthodoxy Jesus and the truth, or is your orthodoxy leftist identitarianism? And there's, I'm just using that as one example, please, so don't get too crazy about what I'm saying, because there are equivalent distortions, even if very different substantially, but equivalent distortions, equivalent extremes, maybe is one way to say it, on the right and on multiple sides of this. We don't even have to say it's this left-right thing. I mean, those are the kind of the big ones. But anyways, or on the other side of it, somebody says something really positive about Bernie Sanders or Joe Biden or something. But I guess the point is, and so I think that, again, I've tried purposely not to get too engaged in a lot of this stuff, but I've sensed it around the edges and just kind of tuned it out in certain things that have happened in the Sangha, in the group, with Craig and with other things. But it's funny for me, because the disagreements with Craig, this was the point I was trying to make, are not really political. I think for a lot of people I've noticed there is a very strong left liberal bias in a lot of the spiritual, people, for example, that would find themselves resonant with a teaching like Craig offers, or even an Adyashanti or an Eckhart. I don't know the numbers on this, but they seem to be crowds that are liberal, by and large, kind of educated, liberal. And I've become more heterodox over time. So there's ways in which that dimension of things just doesn't really align for me. I saw a teacher not too long ago bringing in, actually, I saw this. I was on the board of a meditation group briefly a long time ago before a lot of this kicked off for me. But it was very, very leftist, very social justice, like having affinity groups, having colored people only meditations, and just all these rigid boundaries around identity categories. And I saw a teacher do this not too long ago where they were having, like LGBTQ specific, a teacher with quite a big following, and they were starting to do some of these affinity groups and identity categories and things like that. And even if there are some good intentions there and some truths there that could be teased out, I've just seen where that path leads so many times. I think culturally now most people have seen where a lot of this stuff leads, and just how this stuff, these theories, the practical implications of it, and it's not good fruit. I don't want to get too far into all that, but with Craig, some of my disagreements with him have actually not been the political. That's what's kind of interesting about this, for me at least. I find that to be one of the areas that I actually really resonate with and appreciate and have come to connect with more. See, when I started out with him, I was still kind of coasting on the fumes of that identity. It was falling apart for me, that kind of really leftist identity. And it was kind of being deconstructed and just breaking apart in part because I was just in a lot of turmoil and pain. But there were deeper dimensions of reality and truth coming on board, and so it was relativizing some of that stuff. But I can remember initially, at least, having some very kind of puritanical reactions against some of the ways that he would speak, and language games and language is can be a very big issue when you get into kind of identitarianism and some of the leftist stuff. Tone policing, word policing, all that stuff. I don't want to say that too strongly, but I was getting kind of having stuff come up in that direction initially. But COVID and many other things, and just a lot of personal evolution and growth and change, and to where, just I'm just kind of mapping out some different things here. That one thing I have really admired about Craig in particular is he is not really dogmatic in that kind of identity. I guess woke is one way to say it. Woke. Ideological fixation leaning. That part of his message is, and I think this is where a lot of people have actually, I think some people, I'd have to ask him to confirm, but I've gotten the sense some comments he's made and certain things I've observed, that this has been the stumbling stone for some people, is that he's not just partisan carrying the line for, certain orthodoxies within leftism and liberalism around language and around, certain other norms, that he'll say things that are outside the pale, outside the realm of what, we should say, what one should say as a spiritual person or liberal person. And I actually really like that about him and have appreciated that more and more as I've grown and matured. There's a balance there that he's not really primarily motivated. He has political leanings, we all do. But part of his message is, let's not get totally identified there. Let's not get totally trapped there where we can't hear each other. All throughout his teachings, he's been encouraging having open dialogue and talking about friends that he has in law enforcement, and just one silly example. And a part of it is because there's a deeper dynamic there. Again, if you get fixated at the political, it's a relatively shallow dimension. And so you don't want that to be the driving identity. You want God to be primary, always. And God is not going to fit cleanly into any category. If you think you understand it, it's not God. God is transcendent. And there's no way to categorize that, really. I mean, it infuses and hopefully brings about a more heterodox, a more open, a more liberated approach to everything. It's not to say that truth is relative. That's a trap too, postmodern, and that's largely a leftist trap, to be perfectly honest. But yeah, that he'll encourage, relating to people, connecting to people in a deeper way. But even in the times when he does kind of go on a little bit of a political thing about, whatever issue around COVID, or there's a lightheartedness there, I can say, in the way that he talks about it. And I can imagine, just having spent time in spiritual circles, it really chafes a lot of people, some of the things he says. Not that he's like a right-wing extremist or anything like that. He's not at all. But you can tell he's not afraid. Well, I'm sure there is some fear. Actually, I can say there probably are ways that he kind of holds. What am I trying to say here? I guess one part of it is I actually agree with some of his political things more and more. There's ways in which I'm probably further in a, I guess, traditionally conservative direction now. And there's some ways, and so there's some ways that I feel a connection with him, actually, when he brings some of that stuff up, and it doesn't offend me, and I'm like, go buddy, go, bring more life into this. People in this community need to hear stuff like this. They need to hear different opinions. But there are other dimensions that I really disagree with. But you come to recognize that when you're contending with a human being, you're contending with complexity. You just are. I mean, you just are. That a full human being is going to not totally cleanly map up into any identity that you want to fit them into. And to hold your opinions a little bit loosely, to recognize within myself, man, I've evolved on so many things. And just more and more evolving in the direction of, let's just be open to the truth and to talking and not viewing ourselves so strongly through those lenses. You don't totally throw them out, no, because you got a political, you don't want to just completely denude yourself of any, you're not just this like perfect, I don't know, I've talked so much, I'm getting tired here. What else can I say? Don't let your peace and your comfort be disturbed by misalignment with the teacher. Don't fixate there as much as you can. Just move on. Just let it pass through you. Just stay connected to a good feeling inside of yourself, and trust we're all going to say stupid shit. Sometimes and that you may not even be understanding. You may be misapprehending what the person was saying, or maybe you're only partially understanding, and the important thing is are they a good person? Do they care to be a good person? Is there some integrity there? You know, not that they're perfect in any of these categories, but I guess it's kind of just that simple, you know? Do you enjoy being around them? Is there like a fundamental just feeling of joy and freedom and safety and peace and goodness, comfort, relaxation on some level, spirit? Is there room for humor? Is there room for, I don't know about humor. Yeah, I guess. I mean, I don't know. Can you see that they're trying their best, that they're trying to do something good? Can you see that you're trying to do your best, that you're trying to do something good? You see that I'm trying my best. You don't have to agree with your teacher 100%, not even close. But in the ways that would be helpful to you, are they able to meet you there? Is there some support there that they could offer? Just keep it simple in that sense, you know, pragmatic. I don't know if I want to say that, but just keep it simple. Anyways, may you be well. Take care. Goodbye.